So I've just saved this file, and now I'm going to jump back over to Unity. Okay, so at this point, instead of directing the output just to the console down here, I actually want to see it right here in my screen. I actually want to put a text box out here. So because this is more of a text adventure game, I want to have a text box and have all of my text right here on screen. So here inside my hierarchy, I want to right click with nothing selected. I want to right click and go down to UI and say text. From here, what you'll notice is it kind of puts this big square kind of out here, and then does some other stuff with some coordinates and that kind of stuff. Now, it also creates this new text down here in the corner. Now, yours might show up slightly differently. You might put it somewhere else, like maybe up here in the corner. But the idea is we want to go through and actually customize this, make it proper for what we're expecting to see. So the first thing I want to do is kind of figure out where this text object lives inside my view over here. So over here in the scene view, I'm going to press this 2D button right up here at the top. And when I do, it's going to spin the camera around and look straight down the Z-axis. Now, I can kind of move the camera around. I can right click while holding Alt and kind of zoom in, zoom out. But with the text object over here selected, if I mouse over the scene and press the F key, it will frame selected, which is the same as doing edit frame selected, onto the object itself. Now, what you'll notice is the canvas is much bigger, and we can see that by zooming out just a little bit and taking a look. This white box going all the way around the border, that's the canvas itself. So instead of limiting myself to this small little box that you're seeing right here, because if you were to take this text and you were to just like paste it a bunch of times, you'll notice you don't actually get all the text. It only limits you to new text, new text, new. And that's because this horizontal and vertical overflow, these two values here, are actually trying to word wrap it, but then truncation means to terminate the string at a certain point. So we actually lose all that information. Now you could come in here and try to resize this box, but there's a much easier way to make this small little box over here as big as this entire canvas. So what we want to do is, with the text selected, I can go ahead and get rid of this all this extra text that I dumped in. That was just for demonstration purposes. So what I can do is make this box as big as this canvas. So with it selected, I want to pick this little crosshair thing right here. This is actually a button. So if you click on that, you'll get this Anchor Presets listing. Now it says across the top here that if you press and hold Shift, you'll also set the pivot, which is this little blue circle right here in the center. If yours is kind of gray, meaning you can't really select it or move it, that's these buttons up here at the top. Pivot versus center. Notice how it switches enabled, disabled. And then local is local coordinate system versus global. So center would be if you had multiple objects and you had them all selected, it puts the center point right in the center of all those different objects. Pivot locates the one on that specific object. So with the pivot able to be moved around, that actually changes how this object can be rotated and scaled and kind of sized and skewed. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to resize that box, but then also move its pivot so it's still at the center of however big that box becomes. And then I also want to change the position of the box itself. Now notice across the top here we have left, center, right, stretch, and across the left side we have top, middle, bottom, stretch. So I want to stretch it in both the X and Y axes, so I'm going to press and hold both Shift and Alt or Option if you're on a Mac. And this bottom corner, you'll notice that when you press those buttons, press and hold Shift, you get this little dot, which indicates the pivot. And if you press and hold Alt, you'll notice the arrows kind of change positions to indicate how it's going to scale and that kind of stuff. So if you press and hold both, Shift and Alt or Option, you can see down here in the bottom we get that big crosshair that covers the entire little box right here and the blue dot in the center. So if we click that, what you'll notice is this text right here, as well as this blue box, they're going to kind of shift. You'll also see this 4 triangles thing right here in the center, those are the anchors. That's how the screen is springy around the border of this particular UI. So as soon as I click this button, watch those different options as they move. So you'll notice the text has jumped up here to the upper left corner. The little four triangles in the center have gone out to all four corners. The blue dots have gone to the four corners, and the blue circle is right there in the center. So to get rid of that, you can click back in this button, or kind of click off of it somewhere to select somewhere else. But at the moment, this might be perfectly fine. However, this is a text adventure game. Text is going to be front and center. So I actually want to put this new text and all the rest of my text right here at the center and kind of grow it out from there. So the first thing I want to do is come down here to my text component, this guy right here at the top. Remember, these are these attached objects. They're components. They give us functionality. So I want to come down here to the bottom where it says paragraph and then alignment, and I want to change this to center, which is that middle button. So you see the text has moved to the center. And then in the next three buttons, I want to pick that center button as well. Now that's the middle. So we have center, middle, and it puts the text right there. Now I don't have to worry about any of these other settings, but maybe I want this text to pop. Maybe I don't want this skybox because, well, a text adventure game doesn't usually have a skybox. So I actually want to use a couple of different colors. The first thing I want to do is change the color of the text to, let's go with completely white. So sliding this little color picker into the upper left corner, we get 255, essentially 255 straight down this line. Now be extra careful if you start messing with this alpha channel. If you kind of slide that back and forth, you might notice it's a little difficult to see, but your text will go away. It will start blending with the background. So we want that at 100%, so 255. That way it's still right there and visible. You can also see it right over there a little bit. So now I want to turn off that skybox so it doesn't conflict really with my text, because that's a pretty good blend right there. So I'm going to pick the main camera. I'm going to come over here to the clear flags and change from skybox. I want to change that to solid color. Now this blue color might be perfectly fine, but I want this to contrast and be fairly sharp. So I'm going to change the background color to completely black. So grabbing that color picker all the way to the bottom left corner, it should be 0000 in the RGB alpha channels. Now in this case, the A alpha channel doesn't matter if it's 0 or 100%, because this is actually the background clear color and it doesn't blend the way something like this UI object would. So just worth keeping in mind, it doesn't matter here, but it does absolutely matter here on your text object. So if your UI suddenly goes away, double check the alpha channel on your color. Okay, so at this point, I want to jump over to the code and actually send that debug log to this object. However, you might have noticed there's a number of the word text popping up in different spots here. I have text, the name of the game object. I have text, the name of the component, and then we have some text in here. And you'll notice just above that text right there, that's the property for this particular object. So we're going to be, when we assign values to this, we're going to be talking to this game object, talking to its component, and then talking to its property. So that's text, text, and text, and we're going to be putting text in there. It can be a little confusing. So instead what I want to do to try to break up some of this monotony is to go through and change this text up here. Let's just change its name. So I want to, with it selected, I can click again, or with it selected, I can hit F2 on my keyboard, or I can right click on it and go down to rename. Any of those three ways will get you into rename mode. And I want to just change this thing to say main text. Now that means when I go looking for this object, I will need to use that particular name, those words, main and text. Okay, and again, I'm going to save this scene just in case Unity decides to crash. And now I'm going to go back to my script, and actually start doing something to this scene. So back over here in my script, one of the first things I want to do is take that debug log that we were talking about earlier and do basically the same thing, except this time I want to send it to the text that we just created, our UI element. So the first thing I want to do is find that particular object and cache it. The idea here is that I don't want to be going through as my game plays. Let's say update is ticking however many times per second. I don't want to be asking the scene for that particular game object. I don't want to be asking that particular game object for its component. Those are expensive calls, and it can be a real waste of performance. It can kind of slow your game down, especially if you have a lot of game objects, a lot of components out there, a lot of stuff happening. So what I want to do is inside start, remember start happens once, I want to ask the scene for that game object. We want to go find that main text. Then we want to find the text object off of that. And then we want to hold on to that value. So to do that, I'm going to create a text object that's going to act as a reference to the text object that we created over in our scene that'll represent that component. So up here at the top of the file, roughly line 7, I'm going to create that reference. So the thing is, it is a text object. But you'll notice the IntelliSense completion window here, the text completion, is not giving me code completion for a text object. It doesn't have any clue what that particular text object is. It sees some stuff out there like text alignment, text anchor, so on and so forth. What's actually happening here is we've not pulled in the systems from the Unity engine where text actually lives. Now you can go out and search Google and find a reference to where that information lives, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's part of the UI. So somewhere in the Unity engine, there is a framework that is the UI. So we need to bring that in. So in this case, because I know that the type that I want to talk to is text, if I hit escape or click off of it so that I deselect that completion window, if I now mouse over text, you'll see I get this show potential fixes. Now if I click on that, it's going to tell me a series of things that it thinks might be proper solutions to this file. So looking down through this list, we have these MIME types, which are related to like email and that kind of stuff. Not what I'm dealing with here. We have this using UnityEngine.ui. Well, I said if we're dealing with text, and that was in that UI menu that we created in our hierarchy just a second ago, this is probably what we're looking for. Now, fully qualified text, maybe, but it gives us multiple options. So we'll kind of ignore that for just a second. And then generate the type. Well, I don't want to generate it. I know it already exists. Unity, someone at Unity already wrote it. And fix the typo text. Well, it's not a typo. It's the correct word. So we want this second item down using UnityEngine.ui. And if you click on that, you will automatically get line number 4 injected into your code using UnityEngine.ui. This is where all the UI functionality lives. And you'll notice as soon as you do that, text now stops complaining, doesn't have that red squiggly under it, but then also goes to this teal color, indicating that the reference was indeed found. Now, that's the type. And if you remember back to day 1 when we were talking about variable declaration, we have the type and then we have the identifier. And then optionally we have a value after that. In this case, we have the type. Now let's give it an identifier. So let's call this screen because it's going to represent the screen that we're talking to. And as far as a value is concerned, we're actually going to rely on a search of the scene to find our game object named main text, and then we're going to drill into it and find the text component. So now that we have the game object main text over in our scene, and we have the text object called screen here inside our code, we need to actually link those two items together. So the code to do that, we have a couple of different ways that we can kind of search throughout the scene. The second more general way, where we're just going to find an object of a particular type, we'll look at that later on, but here we already know that it's this particular game object. It already has a name, so we can look for it directly. We can find it directly. Now, when we're talking about finding game objects, we can talk to the game object class itself. Just like we have debug where we have some functionality there, we can actually talk to game object and then throw your dot operator on there and go looking through the different methods available to you, methods, properties, etc., that are available to you right here in this code. And so the one that I'm looking for is actually find right there at that was already selected, and it's a method, so I need the parentheses. And you'll notice here that it says that this method takes in a string that happens to be called name. This is the name of the game object that we're going to try to find, and if it finds it, it will return that. So we're going to look for a game object named main text. And when we go looking for that, it may not find it. There might be an issue. Somebody might have renamed this object. Somebody might have forgotten to name it main text when we were creating it earlier. So what we can do is capture the variable that's returned. If it was the main text object, then it will be that game object. If it wasn't found, maybe there was a name mismatch or something like that, then we'll get back null, meaning the object was not found. It's kind of the unknown type. So to capture that, we can have a game object, and we can just call it go, and set that equal to whatever game object that find returns to us. And then all the way at the far right, throw in your semicolon to end that statement. And the idea here is that we want to ask the question, was go, the game object, was it actually found? So we can very simply ask if go, and then put a body on there. And the idea is if go actually has some information, if it actually contains the game object, then that if statement will be true. If it doesn't have anything and go is null, then that if statement would be false, and it would go on and continue through the rest of the code. Now the idea here is if we don't have the game object, then we want to alert to the player. We wouldn't necessarily want to crash or anything like that, so we can actually do an else right after that line, because if you don't have the game object, do the otherwise. So in this case, maybe we want to log out to the console, hey, you don't have this particular object. Did you forget to name it or something like that? So in that case, we could debug log to the console, but maybe we want to put a little bit more emphasis on it. So there's also, if you do debug dot, you'll notice there's a series of other log methods out there. And the one that I want to look for to really drive home the fact that you did not name it correctly or it wasn't found or something is this log error. So just like debug log, you throw your parentheses on there and you say what your error would be. In this case, let's say main text not found. And then in that statement, so your string inside, parentheses, and then semicolon. So we would see that if something wrong happened in our scene. But let's say something correct happened. We actually found the game object. So Go would actually have that text object, that text game object inside itself. Now we need to go looking through the components to find our text component. So to do that, off of that game object, we do the dot operator, and we're going to look for a specific component. We're going to get a component. And right there it is, get component. So we can select that, and get component operates in a special kind of way. It actually wants you to send whatever the type is as part of these diamonds right here at the beginning. The less than, greater than together form kind of a diamond. So here, this T that you're seeing inside that tooltip, that's the type itself. And we're looking for a type of text right up here at the top. So we can feed in text. And again, this is also a method, so we need the parentheses on there. And we need the semicolon to end that statement. So if it finds the text object, then we need to hold on to it. So we can then turn around and say, well, screen, our variable up at the top, that's where we're going to store this information. So let's set screen equal to whatever get component returned to us. But there is always the possibility that something broke. Maybe we accidentally created an object that wasn't a text UI item, or we removed that text component or something. Something went wrong and we just did not have that script. So we can also do a quick check. See, if we have the screen, then we're fine. We don't need to do anything. But if we didn't find the screen, or sorry, the text object, and filled in the screen, then we would need to alert the player, hey, something about your main text object went wrong. So we could say if not screen, because if it's null, that's kind of like a 0. It's kind of like false. Here, we would use the not operator, the exclamation point, to flip it. So if it's false, it becomes true. If this if statement is true, then it runs the body right after that. So here, we would want to do something very similar to this debug log and inform them that the text component was not found. So we can do debug.log error, and we can tell them that the text component was not found on main text. Something fairly descriptive, but not overly verbose. And now, assuming all this stuff worked out, we found the main text game object, we found the screen component, or sorry, the text component, and we saved it inside screen. Now we can actually try to do something with this object. Now, in a real production app, you would want to make sure that you only touched the value of screen if it was actually found. In this case, this is just debugging code, and I don't really care about it because I should be going back and fixing this issue if I ever ran into this. So a crash, in my mind, would be the same thing as the object missing. I would need to fix it either way. So to verify that our text was actually working to our screen, I would want to talk to screen. Remember, that's the text object. And looking through the text on that component, I wanted to talk to its text property. So if I do a dot operator right after that, I can go looking through this list of items, and there's a good number of things that if you go looking through that component or just game objects in general, you're going to find a lot of similar items here. The one that I'm specifically looking for is the text property. And Unity happens to call this with a lowercase t. So just type out text, and that is the property. It's a string, so it's expecting a value. Well, we did our debug log just a second ago, so let's send it the value hello world. And save that code and jump back over to Unity. Now over here in Unity, it's going to compile that file, and assuming that we have a main text listed right here, assuming that we have a text component, those two checks that we put in there should successfully find both of those items. So we shouldn't see either of our two errors. But if we did, they would pop up here in the console, and the first one would say if we had a name mismatch, it would refer to that. If our text component over here was maybe accidentally removed, then we would see that that text component wasn't found. So now that we have the code set up, the scene set up, I'm going to go ahead and save this scene. Again, if we see an asterisk up there, it means that the scene is not yet saved, and if Unity crashed, we would lose some work, so make sure you save your stuff. And at this point, I'm going to press play. Now, if everything works out, we should see hello world, which we do. So at this point, everything for getting this project up and running seems stable. Now we can really start to tear into the actual code and the layout and that kind of stuff. So at this point, if anything that you're seeing is not matching what I'm seeing here, then please go back through and double check all your different settings. Otherwise, please continue on to the next video.